All right, we're looking at the existence of God. And it is true that as much as we talk about the existence of God, our point really is more of arguing for now on the theistic evidence or arguments. In other words, that this is a theistic world, that the belief in God, that God could be Jewish God, could be an Islamic God. For now, we just say the world seems to be seems to have originated from God, or a God, if you please. We will later on zero in on Christianity and the God of the Bible. But for us to do that, we still have to talk about the Bible first, before we can zero in on the Christian understanding of God. Now, what I'm going to do, because I've added one more slide after I sent to this slide, I may have to share from my side, because I'm not going to know which one I've added. But just be ready there in case I get stuck somewhere. Okay. All right, here we go. I just added one more slide. Okay, let's go ahead. Just as a way of recapping, what is apologetics? We are not apologizing, we are defending what we believe to be true. Secondly, it is an activity of the Christian mind. A Christian mind is a mind that embraces faith. In other words, it is faith reasoning. It is a reasoning faith. An apologist is one who is prepared to defend the message against criticism or the gospel or the truth, biblical truth, against criticism and distortion, and to give it evidences of its credibility. That's what you find in the book. Groothuis says it is a rational defense of the Christian worldview as objectively true. It is very important. Rationally compare. All right, thank you very much. Because of the voluminous nature of these discussions, it's going to be very difficult to be detailed, because we need to cover. That's why we want to do reading before, so we can have a good discussion when the time comes. Just make me your co-host so I can run the PowerPoint. All right, thank you. So I just wanted to give you a background to these arguments, why they are cogent, because you'll find that even Christians tend to push back on some of this and arguing that they undermine faith. All we need is faith. We don't need all these arguments. And there's a lot of that also that is out there in Christian literature, in theological circles. Okay, I was just on this one, that we don't just want brute facts about God's existence, but we want something that locks or interlocks with meaning and purpose of our life. In other words, the existence of God, as we'll see later on when we end this lecture, must be subjectively engaging. In other words, it must also exhibit some attractiveness, some beauty. It mustn't just be, sometimes you can argue for God's existence and be a very ugly person, not intellectually, but as a human being. So we want to also, in defending God or Christian worldview, show not only its factuality, but also its beauty. That's very important. So it mustn't just be rational, so it invokes both. Actually, it mustn't just invoke only rational legitimacy. It must also have an emotional appeal in it, the attractiveness I'm talking about. Now, the text, 1 Peter 3:15, just if we can just use that as we introduce these arguments. It says, be ready to give a defense to everyone who asks for a reason for the hope that is in you, with meekness and fear. But then the question I want to ask right there is, do we need the reasons to believe? Or we find reasons when we believe? That's not off, it's all. In other words, do The reasons you advance for your faith, are they the reasons that make you to believe, that made you to believe? And those may not be the same. I could be talking about teleological argument, cosmological argument, intelligent design. But that's not how I became a Christian. It was not through those arguments. In other words, we are not mapping a path to God here, that for you to arrive at God, you must go through these arguments. Sometimes, in most cases, these reasons become more evident because of our faith. In other words, as we believe, we begin to see 2 Corinthians 5:7, we walk by sight, not by faith, or we do not walk by sight, but by faith. But it is also true that faith sees. It is by faith that we see. It is by faith that we can also be able to reason. Hebrews 11:3, by faith we understand. This is a way of trying to say science and religion, or science and faith, are not really enemies. In Psalms 39:9, in your light, we see light. In the light of God, we understand nature. In the light of God, we understand these arguments. In the light of God, we see the conclusiveness and the comprehensiveness of this argument. I think it was C.S. Lewis who said, I believe that the sun has risen, not because I see it. That's not the argument. It is because by it I see everything. By the sun, I see everything. When Hugh Ross, one of the astrophysicists, said, I found God through science, and I was listening to another testimony by Wing Meng, laser eye specialist, one of the top-notch, saying that he found God by studying the eye. That is true, but if you really unpack that, it is God who finds us. It is God who finds. One would say, I found God through science, but it is God who found me by using science. In other words, it is God to use science to reach to me, rather than me using science to reach to God, as if God was hiding and needed a scientific formula to be discovered. You've heard of the arguments in philosophy of science that even the very modern science, the modern science, starting from the Reformed era around 14th, 15th century, was actually founded on Christianity. It was the Christians were the ones who were leading the scientific project or scientific enterprise. And what made that was their belief in a rational God. So the belief in a rational God fueled scientific discovery. By believing that God is a rational God, then they were actually motivated to look for reason and rational and laws in nature. Because if God is a rational, intelligent being, so his creation will exhibit the same qualities. So science then was propelled by this understanding of a God who's rational. And then they study science. And that actually, every Kepler and others will tell you that those scientists were actually the ones who pushed, those Christians, they were actually the ones who pushed the whole scientific enterprise. And it was actually founded on this understanding that God, who created the universe, is a rational God. So the rationality and the intelligibility of the universe is actually premised on an intelligent and a rational God. There are objections to the existence of God, and we're going to sum them up in 5 or 6. Many of them, there are many, maybe these are the key ones. The problem of evil. Whenever you listen to an argument between an atheist and a Christian theologian or person, you'll find that at some point they come to this, if God exists, why do we have so many deaths? If God exists, why of rape and crime? If God exists, why 9/11? If God exists, why do we have COVID? And this actually is an age-old argument that is coined the Epicurean paradox, talking about the omnipotence and the almightiness and the all-lovingness of God. And this argument on the underlined part is God willing to prevent evil but not able? In other words, is he a good God but not almighty? Then he is not omnipotent. In other words, if God is willing to prevent but is not able, that is not omnipotent. And yet we say he's omnipotent. But if he's able, that is omnipotent. but is not willing, then is not malevolent. Then is not a good God. It's not a sorry, I need to. All right, then whence cometh evil? If God is both evil, sorry, God is both able and willing, in other words, omnipotent as well as almighty as well as all loving, then why do we have evil? If he's neither able nor willing, then why call him God? That is basically coming from like 400 or so, 300 years before Christ. That was the Greek Epicurean philosopher, Epicurus, by the way, who raised that. And it comes in many ways, the problem of evil. And there are many ways of responding to this, but we're not going to get into that because you could argue that God is omnipotent and is omnipotent, but is not good. You see, you could argue and establish a God who's cruel, who exists. Now, God's existence does not necessarily mean that he must be a good God. He could be the Greek gods were known to be very capricious and vengeful, but they believed to be existing. You know, God's existence and his character are two different things. You could have a very cruel God, but who exists. Now, the fact that God is not good, the fact that God failed to prevent evil, maybe does not mean that he does not exist. It may mean that he actually is connected to evil. But when we show through resurrection and the Gospels later on and the Bible, we actually show not a God who exists only, but a God who's also loving. In other words, a person says, because I lost my aunt, therefore God does not exist. Well, you still have to deal with the fact that you lost your aunt. And it doesn't mean that now that God does not exist, you're not going to lose any of your aunts. You know, dropping God does not prevent you from evil. Unless you were to argue and say, if I believe in God, I will lose people, so let me stop believing in God. So you cannot say, because I believed in God, my aunt died. You still have to give an answer why your aunt died or why your child had cancer. And I'm not going to argue on all these points, otherwise we will not be able to finish this. Lack of empirical evidence, I argue that belief in God is just a faith matter, and some call it God of the gaps, because you cannot explain it and then you say God did it. Since God is often considered transcendent and beyond empirical observation, the existence of God becomes a matter of faith rather than evidence. But then people want to show that faith is based on evidence. In other words, it is not a blind faith, divine hiddenness, that God, argue that if God existed, he would have proved himself beyond reasonable doubt. But reasonable doubt by whose standard? Those who believe feel that God's evidence of his existence is comprehensive. So what do you want God to do in order to believe that he exists? Do you want him to do what? Christ was here, he died on the cross, he healed the sick, he raised the dead, and no one, very few, there were still others who did not believe. Moses was there, he opened the sea, they walked through, but at the end of that whole miracle, experience that miracle, they still wanted to go back to Egypt. So what is it that you would want God to do that would compel you to a point where there's no way but to believe in God? There's enough information for us to believe, but it is never so much that you can't not believe if you want to believe. If you don't want to believe, there's always a choice. The problem of religious pluralism, there are so many religions. How do we know this is true? The fact that there are many religions doesn't mean that God exists. It means we need to find out which one, what nature, what is the nature of this God? Why are there so many gods? You can't say because there are so many stories about God, therefore there's no God. Maybe that's why there are so many stories about God. It is what there is God, and people are trying to understand this being. There are evolutionary explanations. Of course, evolution with this natural selection, that actually things happened naturally to natural selection. This is a materialistic, naturalistic paradigm or worldview that says everything can be linked to matter. But that also creates all kinds of problem. Is thought a matter? What about many other things that are not linked to matter, as we look at consciousness, for example, that are not matter? How do you define those? Evolution, as some would argue, it can show the survivor. That is microevolution, the survivor, but it doesn't show the arrival of the fittest. So we still have to go to a point where, how did the fittest arrive? We have to move to a point where now you can't be selecting from what exists. How did the one entity or species that is doing the selecting, how did it arrive? You still have to talk about the origin of life, and evolution doesn't help very much when it comes to that. There's argument from inconsistent revelations. If there is this question about the reliability of religious experiences and texts. I mean, there's too many. There are Bibles, there are Vedas, there's Quran, and then how do you know which one is which? And of course, there's an atheist Bible. I wanted to take time to go through it, but obviously it would show that everything is supposed to be emanating from nature. Now, yes, the other point I wanted to make, as you go through YouTube's or doing your own research, you'll come across these four people, Richard Dawkins, Sam Harris, Christopher Hitchens, Daniel Dennett. Let me just say something about this, guys. These are known as the new atheists. In other words, they are called the four horsemen of the apocalypse. They came up after the 9/11 and were very, very rigorous and very, very abrasive in their attack on the existence of God. Up until then, yes, you had atheists, but it was not a big thing. But these guys have really pushed this idea of atheism to a new level. Dawkins, for example, is the most popular one, visiting universities, pulling serious crowds, arguments, debates, books that they've written. Sam Harris from America, Richard Dawkins from Britain, and Christopher Hitchens is late, and I'm not sure if Daniel Dennett is still alive. But Daniel Dennett, so I mean, these guys, they are approaching atheism from different angles, but these are basically your evangelists for atheism. They really like your evangelists going out there to prove and to argue that God does not exist. But what is very interesting, especially after 9/11, is that they are pulling so many crowds. Those universities are packed. Those venues are packed with people who are coming to listen. But those are not Christians only. They are also those who don't believe in God. But the question is, if you don't believe in God, why are you attending a lecture on God who does not exist? I mean, why do you want to know? Are you not sure? I mean, why do you want to go and listen? If God, because it until the new atheists, this whole idea of the existence of God was dying in the sense that no one was interested in God to a point intellectually. It was like a given that God does not exist, and people were not even arguing. But the new atheists have actually created more interest. I remember a bus in the UK at some point, it was a few years ago, written that God may not exist, so just feel free and enjoy yourself. And it was going around, and it was a very exciting time, exciting experience. But the fact of the matter is, if people still attend those lectures, maybe they are not sure that God does not exist. If Christopher Hitchens and others are going around preaching that God does not exist, maybe they feel they have to make that point. Otherwise, if they don't make it, people will believe in God. So there is this discomfort, this restlessness that we can actually notice on these guys. All right. How about objections in South Africa and Africa? The objections when it comes to God's existence in Africa, the objections are not so much on the existence of God. Africa and the object I mean, there's a saying that in Africa nobody tells you that God exists. We know God exists generally. It is just which God. That's the issue. South Africa, Mozambique, and Botswana may have more people that are atheists, but the percentage is even less than 20. Around 15% in South Africa or so. But the majority of people believe. They believe in the existence of demons, in the existence of God. You know, it's difficult. It's like in the ancient world. It would be very difficult in the ancient world not to believe in God. There were just too many things that are happening for you not to believe in God. More like Africans. If you grow up in the village, maybe unless you grow up in town, if you grow up in the village, it's difficult for you not to believe that there are powers that are at play and you need protection. So for Africans, believing in God is not an issue. It is more of which God, Christian God. There's what they call henotheism. Henotheism is different to polytheism. Polytheism is a belief in many gods and worshiping those gods. Henotheism, which is more the sense for Africans, is to believe that there are gods but we worship this God. You know, this is a Christian God, this is a white man's God, this is our God, this is their God, and we worship. So they may be worshiping one God, but believing that there are other gods. Unlike monotheism, that says there's only one God. If you claim that you have a God, and if that God is not this God, your God is not the God. I mean, you go to Babylon, that was the argument. You can't have evangelism if you don't have monotheism. Monotheism is the basis for evangelism. In other words, Acts 17, Paul says, you've got so many gods, and even in a stake, an altar for an unknown God, he says, I'm going to talk about this unknown God. At the end, in his conclusion, he says, this unknown God is the God that needs to be worshipped. In other words, monotheism seems to challenge all other gods that are supposed to be existing. And of course, in South Africa, evils of colonialism, apartheid, slave in America and others, and Christianity as a white man's religion. Those are the arguments that are put out there. But those arguments don't argue against the existence of God. They just argue against worshiping or embracing this God. They believe as Africans that they've got their own religion, they've got their own God or gods, depending where you are, either East or West or Southern Africa. Southern Africa, you'll have more ancestors than the East. In the West, you'll have other gods, myriads of gods that are worshipped through, that is, they are the medium, as the Catholics would maintain, venerated. They're worshiping this one God, but through other gods, they call those gods. So that would be the issue of this concept in our context in Africa. All right, but let me jump, because I'm taking a lot of time now. Let me just on this slide, I'll just leave it like this, that the whole arguments for God's existence is based on the Bible. We can show that God exists because the Bible says in the beginning God created, and we can argue, as evangelists would do, show the fulfillment of prophecy, history, Daniel chapter 2, the resurrection, as we would show later on in these lectures. But these arguments, these philosophical arguments or proofs, are actually based on what we call natural theology. These intelligent design, cosmological arguments we're going to look at, they are based on what we call natural theology. In other words, it is arguing, theologizing from the revelation of God in the nature, not in the Bible. In other words, you're looking at nature, and from there you posit and argue that God must exist. Because if this is there and this is the complex and the sophistication in this, then it must actually infer that there's a mind. So that's called natural theology. It is theologizing, not from the sacred text, but theologizing from special revelation, nature. Psalms 19 verse 1, the heavens declare. It's like the heavens are pronouncing the glory of God. That's your natural theology. And the firmament shows his handiwork. And Paul says, because what may be known of God is manifest in them, for God has shown it to them. And that is also the argument that is used for special revelation as a basis for natural theology. These are the arguments. We're not going to look at them. We're going to come back to them and follow the structure in our textbook. The Kalam cosmological argument. There are many cosmological arguments, but the one that is popular is the Kalam argument, which William Craig Lane has really popularized. He's very good at it. It says whatever begins to exist has a cause. The universe began to exist, therefore the universe has a cause. So you see that consistent syllogism. If number one is true and number two is true, then there's no way you can argue against number three. In other words, the conclusion exists has a cause, all right? The universe began to exist. Unless you can show that the universe did not begin to exist, or argue against the first sentence there, then the conclusion will not be warranted. But as you will see as we continue, that the universe is known even today, is believed by many scientists, as opposed to some few years ago that it had a beginning. But this argument, the Kalam cosmological argument, does not say whatever exists as a cause. It says what begins to exist. And this is going to actually open the way for God to exist, because God does not begin to exist. He has no beginning. Everything that is if you can prove that something has a beginning, it must have been started. It has a cause. Every beginning has a cause. And that makes sense. That's a natural argument there. But unless you can show that God has a beginning, then you can argue and say here's a cause. We'll come back to that argument. And then there's a purpose argument for purpose, teleological argument that would include also design. The universe exhibits intricate order, complexity, and purpose. We'll look at that. And therefore, there must be an intelligent designer. Teleological argument is an argument from purpose that even if you were to argue and say the eye evolved, but even from the starting point, when that eye was evolving, there was a purpose that we are actually trying to evolve an eye. There's a purpose, but where did that purpose reside? If you're building a house, you start with a one brick, you know where you are going. You can't just put bricks everywhere and say, oh, wow, I had a house. So if these were built, the building blocks, there must have been a design in someone's mind that says this is where we are going. If you're coming with the eye, actually the eye is one of the intricate parts of the body. They say 50% of the neurons in the mind are actually devoted for the sight, for the eye. Now, if you want to develop an eye by chance or randomly with no purpose, then that's a really good accident for you to have all those parts until you have an eye. The argument then is there must be a purpose that leads to that. But the teleological argument says we see purpose in nature, and that purpose only exists in the mind, in design. If there's a design, there must be a designer. And then there's a moral argument with the moral laws. We'll come, we'll touch on that. And then there's the ontological argument, which is very, very difficult to understand. Ontological argument is a philosophical argument that attempts to prove the existence of God through reasoning about the concept of God itself. That if you can think about a God who exists in your mind, chances are the things we think about must at some point exist outside of the mind. But that's another argument that we're not going to get into now, because it's a struggle to really understand this argument, but it is a very powerful argument. And then, of course, we've got the resurrection of Jesus, which we will not address in this lecture. Now, according to Josh and his father, this is what they look at: the origin of the universe. The origin of the universe, everything that begins to exist has a cause. And either the universe was caused by nothing or God caused it. And the Big Bang cosmology, some of you would follow that argument. There was a time where the universe was said to be eternal, but now with the Big Bang cosmology, there's a belief that 2 billion or 15 billion years ago, the Earth began to exist, or the universe began to exist. If it began to exist, if there was a Big Bang explosion, what exploded? I mean, what exploded? Nothing exploded and something came. But whatever exploded, there is evidence that the world is expanding. And if you reverse that expansion, it should go to some point which they call singularity, which means that there was a time where it started and it moved. So it can't be expanding from eternity. That's the argument. And so, but then the argument is it more better? Is it more understandable to argue that God created the universe, or to say the universe came out of nothing? Can nothing bring something? And the argument is nothing brings nothing. So that's the argument from cosmology. Of course, you could argue and say, but who created God? But you can't. That argument is not sound, because there's nowhere where we say God is created. God always exists as an uncreated, uncaused cause. But where there's a cause, where there is a matter that has a cause, then there must be someone who caused it. I mean, it is difficult to say who created God, because you will not stop anyway. You will say who created that, who created God, who created that infinitely, to infinity. You can't count to infinity, because you don't know where to start. Infinity has no starting point. In other words, the fact that we are here means we started at some point. Otherwise, we would not be here. It's like finding a cell phone on the table and say it has been dropping from eternity. It can't be here. It is supposed to be still from eternity. So there must be a starting point. Where there is a starting point, then there's somebody who started that point. Let me leave that. We can come back with the questions on that one. And then we have a fine-tuned universe. We've already spoken about that. But what's beautiful fine-tuning about this fine-tuning is the anthropic principle. In other words, the universe seems to be fine-tuned to actually support life. It's not just a beauty and design. It is so designed and so fine-tuned to a point where it supports life. They call it that anthropic principle. And as you saw in your book, Earth has rare conditions that allow it to support life. We're not going to get into those. Life must be in the right type of galaxy. If not, there would be no life. Life must be in the right location in the galaxy. If not, the radiation will kill us. Life must have the right type of sun. The size of the sun, the distance between the sun and the earth must be such that it, in other words, anything that is we would freeze or melt. Book says where we are in the galaxy is such that we are even able to study the universe. Otherwise, if we're not where we are, in other words, God did not create us only, He created us so that we can study what He has created and place us in a position to be able to study. Otherwise, if we were placed at some point, we would never be able to see anything or to study. The planets that we see around, the size of the planets around, if any of those planets were smaller than what they are, life would not be sustainable on Earth. In other words, even all the other stars and the other galaxies are not a waste. They are there to support life in this Earth. And it comes as a surprise to some who feel like there's too much waste, there's too much creation, there's too much objects that are there. What's the point? And at some point, people spoke about genes that are waste, genes that are waste. At some point, even the appendix was said to be something that is not needed. It was a tail that is shrinking, whatever. But we're beginning to realize that there is nothing like that. Wasted genes, wasteful genes, or whatever genes. But everything in creation seems to support life and argue and show it. And then there's this amazing issue on the origin of life. Where did life originate? How did it originate? What is life? Now, if there has been attempts at creating life, but so far, we are so far from creating life, it's unbelievable. There's a guy, Dr. Tor, he's not in the field, but he's a biochemist. I think he's in the chemistry, but he has actually argued and challenged the origin of life scientists to actually come up with life. Life is not just matter and protein. It is information, the information that forms the protein. In other words, before you can even have cell, you must have information. And the question is, where is that information comes from? And the argument then is information only comes from a mind. How do you create a cell? That thing is so sophisticated. We're not talking about complexity. We're talking about what's the word? A specificity, that the cell has a language. Let me just read through this thing. Life is not composed only of matter and energy. It is also encoded information. In a single cell, as you saw in your book, Josh argued that, observed that the DNA in one cell contains about, the body has an average of 100 trillion cells altogether. But one cell carries about 8,000 books or 3 billion letters. That's the genome. There's about 3 billion letters, one cell. Imagine now, if all the 100 trillion cells, well, how much information is there? The information on the size of your eye, the color of your eye, on the size of your height, and everything. There is information. The DNA and RNA are not carrying information only. They process it. It's like a computer, but many times faster and powerful than our computers. Now, the argument is, can you look at a computer? Can you actually talk about coding without intelligence? Can you look at the brain? Can you look at the cell and argue that it came because of chance? Stephen Meyer, you could just write that. I wrote a book on Return of the God hypothesis, and he argues that specified information in the cell points to intelligent design. As to that is the best explanation. You can look at other explanation. So they call that argument inference to the best explanation. Inference to the best explanation. Of all the things we know in this life, only intelligent, only mind produces information. So to argue then, they said there was once a time, and that time was just one singularity where information came from nothing, not from a mind. But what actually transpires today, when we look at history, that's how we argue. that information comes from the mind, and that's the whole argument on origin of life and, of course, intelligent design. And then, of course, there's the origin of consciousness. If God is supremely conscious being and He's created us in His image, and therefore we will also be conscious. But how do you even argue? How do you even define consciousness? Because that's not matter. The existence of free will, which is a very extensive discussion on its own, because that also opens the potential existence of evil, that God created free will, created creatures with a free will. Some argue that there's no free will, there's no free will. But for you to say there's no free will, you must have a free will to be able to say that. Otherwise, what you are saying is programmed. So how are we even supposed to listen to you? Because whatever you are saying is programmed. The very fact that you can argue against free will, it means that you've got a free will that argues against the existence of free will. And then, of course, you have existence of objective morality. Where there's a law of morality, there must be a lawgiver. Where there's law, and that law is written in us, and that's the argument from morality. That the very fact that everywhere we go, we seem to agree on certain things that are moral, certain things that you ought to do, not just is, but ought to do, that must show that there must be a lawgiver at some point. All right. Now I'm going to quickly now put this together so that we can now have a interaction with some of these arguments. But I want to just bring them together, then we can open it up. I don't know how we are doing with time, but I don't also want to be bogged down to the details until we lose the bigger picture. All right, you still have the textbook to follow through on some of the arguments that are there. All right, let's look at some of these as we try to bring this to some conclusion and then put all this together. We mentioned objection to the existence of God, why people object to that. Turek and Geisler, one of the first book I read on apologetics many years ago, was entitled, I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist. I don't have enough faith. They were actually arguing that you must have a lot of faith for you to believe. If you see a cell phone and say that cell phone was actually came by chance, some monkeys were playing around and then the cell phone showed up. Actually, the cell phone, in terms of its sophistication, it can't even compare to the cell. It can't even compare to my brain, because it's my brain that produced the cell phone. So if the cell phone, when you look at the cell phone, you argue, you infer from that there must be a person who created the cell phone. What makes you look at the brain and think that it came from nothing? So you have more faith than a Christian. That was their argument. A fool, the Bible says in his mind, there is no God. In Romans 1:19-21, the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness, but the unrighteous man suppress the truth in unrighteous. It appeared for some, they rather suppress it for whatever reason, and we'll look at some of those reasons. And so it looks like the Bible says they are without excuse. What can be known about God is revealed via the Bible. It is also revealed. In other words, there's so much around us that makes us to wonder, that makes us to be at awe, that makes us say there must be someone bigger. It's just so much, it is around us. For you not to actually arrive at that, you literally have to fight until you die. Because at every corner, you'll be amazed when you look at the vastness and the complication, the sophistication of creation. What we discover is that people like Darwin, when they looked at the cell, they didn't know as much as it is known today. That is why even the people who are in the research on the origin of life, when they think they're about to understand, then they discover more complexity. In other words, it is becoming even a daunting task to define life. You can know the components of life, what you need, but you can have all those components and yet you may not have life. In other words, as Professor Tor would say, you could be working on a cell and it dies, but what has died? Because all the components of that cell are still there, but the cell is dead. What has disappeared? Because everything that made that cell to be alive is still there, but the cell is dead. So until we can define what life is, we can never understand or even recreate it or replicate it, because we don't even know what we're supposed to replicate. All right. So the argument, of course, goes back to life comes from life. It is God in the beginning. God created. All right. And then there is a famous statement by Thomas Nagel, who says, I want atheism to be true, and I am made uneasy by the fact that some of the most intelligent and well-informed people I know, he was a philosopher at one stage at New York University, at one, what is he saying? I'm made uneasy by the fact that some of the most intelligent and well-informed people I know are religious believers. In other words, that really made him very uncomfortable, because these people are thinking they are intelligent. Why do they believe in God? It isn't just that I don't believe in God. Thomas Nagel continues, naturally hope that I'm right in my belief. Is that I hope there is no God. In other words, I don't want there to be a God. And that seems to be the argument, even though it may not be articulated or stated. It seems to be the argument. I don't want a universe to be like that. I don't want a universe which has God. In other words, I don't want a situation where I must give an account for the decisions I make here on earth. I don't want to be judged. In Acts 17, Paul argues from verse 31, he says, God expects, commands every man everywhere to come to repentance, because he has ordained a day upon which he's going to judge the world by the man, Jesus Christ. And he has shown evidence of that by raising him from the dead. That is 30 and 31, Acts 17. In other words, God is going to judge. That's why the people should repent. And it is that judgment, it is that potential of giving an account that people hate. People want to be free to do as they please. They don't want to be told that you'll give an account. But we'll talk about that when we look at the whole aspect of resurrection. And as a result, they tend to be more inclined towards atheism because it gives them an excuse. There's also, as an argument, I remember Epicurean, then there's Pascal's wager. Pascal's wager, basically, the 17th century scientist and philosopher, suggests that belief in God is rational, is a rational decision, even in the absence of evidence or credible evidence or convincing evidence, because the potential benefits of believing in God, such as eternal salvation, outweigh the potential cost, such as living a religiously restricted life. Of course, there are people who argue and try to destroy that. But here's the argument. I don't know how many of you have listened to Jordan Peterson. At one point, he was asked, he's becoming more theist now in his arguments, Jordan Peterson. Honestly, he does believe in the existence of God. But he said, at one point, he said, I may not know whether God exists, but I want to live as if he exists. In other words, the argument here is believing in God may not disadvantage you, even if it means restricting the way you live. But that restriction, if you look at it seriously, it is a restriction that gives meaning in life. That I'm restricted from killing my wife cannot be a restriction. That I'm restricted from abusing my children cannot be a restriction. The joy of watching a child grow and supporting that child is beautiful, even if there is no God. But Pascal's argument is, if God does exist, then the possibility of hell is there. If God does not exist, then all of us are going to be dead. In other words, those who don't believe in the existence of God will not be able to discover that they were right. But those who believe and God turns out to exist will actually live to see that he did. So most atheists, I want to argue, are basically against the idea of God. They are more like anti-theists technically, or misotheists. They hate God or they're against God, and they end up concluding it does not exist. If you hate God, hate him, but you don't have to remove him. You don't have to drop him. You can just hate him. But because I hate him, because I don't want him to, because I hate him, because I'm against him, therefore, it is easier to say he does not exist. Now, these proofs, as you conclude, form part of Christian apologetics, but not the whole of it. You can see these are cumulative. You can't just use one argument. You have to use all of them, including the resurrection of Christ, to arrive at the God of the Bible. You've got to argue the legitimacy of the Bible, as we will do in our third lecture. You've got to argue the resurrection of this God is the one that is revealed in the Bible, not the Islamic understanding of God, not the Jewish understanding of God, not the Hindu, not the Hare Krishna, not this, but this God. In other words, you move to this God, the Christian God, as you look at this revelation, collective revelation. resurrection. But for you to be able to do that, we still need to argue for the authenticity of the Bible. We still need to argue for the resurrection, because the God we are talking about is the God that raised Jesus Christ from the dead. So we need to talk, if resurrection is true, then Christianity that is based, or a religion that is based on Christianity, on the resurrection of Christ, is also a comprehensive and closer to reality than others that are not. All right, and that's it. That brings us to the end of our very summarized discussion today.